Hey everybody, this will be our first video lecture for Chapter 1, Early Western Civilization. From about 400,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago. The dating, I should explain dating system briefly. B.C.E. stands for before current era. You may also be familiar with the term B.C., which has been used for many years, referring to before Christ. It's the same years. We just use more of a scientific terminology today, BCE, before current or before common era. Same thing. It's all marked from the year 0. So 1000 BCE is 1,000 years before Christ. Today, if today's year 2020, we're 2020 years after. So 1000 BCE is 3,000 years ago. So make sure you're sort of familiar with how that works, and you can look it up. You can Google it if you're still unfamiliar. Your textbook also will talk about it at the beginning. BC, and then of course once we pass the year 0, we start calling it CE for current era, or what you might be more familiar with as AD, which is a terminology that's been used for many years. So this is from 400,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago. That's 1000 BCE. And so we'll get right into it. And get started with the PowerPoints. And as I go through the PowerPoints, you can take notes. Of course, you can rewind and fast forward, and you can pause at any time. And the PowerPoint's only available here as part of the video lecture. So I guess without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And I do follow along with the PowerPoint. So if it's like, it's all Roman numerals, so it's A, B, C, D, I will sort of follow along that way. So try not to get ahead of me. And of course, it doesn't really matter whether you fall behind, because you can always just pause at any time and rewind. So this is Chapter 1 of the Making of the West, Peoples and Culture. And the first section is from the Stone Age to Mesopotamian civilization. Mesopotamia, also sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, is a region of a big part of what is modern-day Iraq, for instance. So this is our first chunk here, 400,000 to 1,000. So Stone Age is really where we're going to start. Stone Age is divided up into a couple different parts. Stone Age, the first part's the Paleolithic. Paleolithic, which is the Old Stone Age. Old Stone, Paleolithic, from about 400,000 years ago to 10,000 BCE, which is 12,000 years ago. Human tools were typically made of stone or bone, hence Stone Age. In the Paleolithic Age, the first people, the first Homo sapiens, the first humans really arise. Modern humans, there's versions of humans before this, but what we think of as a modern human, the Homo sapien, us, really arise in this time period. They typically hunter-gatherers. They lived in Africa, eventually spreading across the world. They roamed around in small groups, sort of nomadic, meaning they moved around constantly, usually looking for food. Men primarily hunted, women primarily gathered fruits, nuts, things like that, plants, and took care of the children. Reproduction being a very important facet of female life. Over time, these Paleolithic people do create more advanced, and I'm still on Paleolithic here, they do create more advanced, complex social organizations. They develop trade, they develop technology, eventually religion, social hierarchies, all the facets of modern civilization. We know very little about religion at this point. We don't really have any records. Really, this is prehistory, actually. History really begins about 5,000 years ago with written records. And so this is really prehistory at this point. We don't know much about religion. We know they buried their dead with weapons, jewelry, tools. So we think they probably had a strong belief in the afterlife. They buried them with these items so that whenever they woke up in the next world, they would have their tools and things with them to continue on in whatever the next life was. Status was often thought to be based upon physical prowess and age. Physical prowess, therefore, meant status was much more likely to be male dominant, and age, male or female is where women could gain status there as an elder. Life expectancy was probably 30 for an average person. So they started producing children young, probably early teens, and if you lived past 30 or 40, you were special. You were an elder. You were quite special. Changes in weather patterns over, about 500,000 years, going back to, 500,000 years ago, is what really caused them to migrate around the world. Eventually, these Paleolithic humans migrate out of Africa into Asia, into Europe, and eventually, after hundreds of thousands of years, they even make it all the way to the Americas. We think they probably followed animals, very possibly. They spent most of their time near water, following animal patterns or climate patterns, better climate, where it was easier, less harsh to live. Eventually, they spread all across the ancient world, and then making it to North America, as I said, about 15,000 years ago, give or take, about then. As they traveled, evidence shows that they invented new types of weapons. They invented boats, skin boats. They invented new types of tools and weapons. And humans generally advanced dramatically over a period of probably they went from cavemen to actually having towns and small towns and villages within 150,000 years. Once they started advancing, they advanced quite quickly. If you think on a geologic time scale, quite fast. After thousands of years, we see them in the Fertile Crescent, for instance. That's Mesopotamia. That's the first important region we'll start talking about. We see them settle there probably 40, 50,000 years ago, where they actually started building towns or little villages. Probably around there. They eventually invent agriculture. They domesticate crops. They learn how to grow food. They domesticate animals. They learn how to actually use animals instead of just grabbing up animals roaming around the wilds. They learn how to put up fences and actually control animals and start to breed animals or domesticate them for use. And this is what really marks the beginning of the Neolithic age. The farming, the domestication of plants and animals, and starting to live, for some, a sedentary lifestyle. Sedentary meaning they stayed in one place. This is what really marks the new Stone Age, the Neolithic. That break from the old to the new is the towns, villages, domestications of crops and animals, and more of a sedentary lifestyle. And of course, an increase in food, quite a bit more food. Since women had more experience already gathering food, for instance, they played a major role in developing farming, while men spent most of their time still hunting and making war. As people became more permanent and they settled down, they start having interactions, which leads to conflict, which leads to warfare eventually. So as I mentioned, they domesticate plants and animals. They learn to herd animals. They learn they don't have to roam around much anymore. They can stay where they are. They can stay in one location. Some of the first animals they domesticated were sheep, pigs, goats, cattle, dogs, or wolves. They domesticated into dogs. And this is really what we often refer to as a farming revolution or agricultural revolution. Without this ability to grow their own food and raise their own animals and to settle down, we would not have modern civilization. This is what makes modern civilization possible. For the better part of 250,000 years, humans just roamed around the earth. Very little changing, we think. And then they settled down, grew their own food, raised their own animals, and boom, everything changes. Everything suddenly changes. Long-distance trade is also significant. We see hunter-gatherers exchange items like weapons and jewelry, pottery, flint, seashells, just any type of things you can think of. This trade, of course, was significant. This trade allowed humans to communicate. It facilitated the spread of ideas and technology, farming technology, which allowed humans across the entire ancient world to really start forming civilizations. This interactions of different types of, that's the wrong way to say it, different groups. This interaction of different groups of humans is what really created civilization and all the ideas and technology that came out as a result of that. Sometimes we also call this a Neolithic revolution. So you'll hear it as the agricultural revolution, the farming revolution, Neolithic revolution. Really, it's all referring to the same thing. So this Neolithic revolution spread food and wealth around. At first, it spread it all around. At first. Still, there was a lot more food available, and this is really where the first power bases are created. And that's not a specific term, that's a general term, meaning the first bases of power, the first concentrations of power and strength were based upon food hoarding. Whoever had the food for a large population, and some of these early towns probably had 30, 40,000 people, you had to feed all those people. And therefore, whoever controlled the food controlled the community. And this is really probably where the first bases of power and strength and wealth and status, real power, started to materialize. And of course, if you have all that food, you need someone to protect it. So you start building armies. And we don't have enough food, but they do have more food. We want to go get their food. We're going to use our army to go get their food. Yeah. And so whoever controlled the food, whoever controlled the water, which the water being used to grow the food, they would supervise complex irrigation systems. They would manage the distribution of food and water. This competition for this control of food, water, and natural resources is what really creates the first cities, the first empires, the first kings, the first warlords. It also creates a division of labor. Another really important part of this is a division of labor. This economic activity divides labor by gender, but male, female, but also divides labor by status. Certain status people do certain types of labor, and other status people do other types of labor, and therefore your job starts to define who you are. Your place in society is defined by what you do and your sex. Women stayed closer to home. Men would leave home and go out and go to war and do still hunting for food. And this, of course, has great lasting ramifications for all society. This really sets us on the course for how society even is in today, modern society. With the dominance of men and the dominance of power and money and wealth and status and hierarchical society, which is all Western civilization is based upon this, a hierarchy of status and wealth. It really all began in the beginning, if you will. I like that. Began in the beginning. Yeah, that's good. I like that. Okay. So this gives you an idea of Mesopotamia, what it looks like. This today will be modern-day Israel. This is Iraq. You've got India over here. This is the Arabian Peninsula. This is Egypt. This is modern-day Turkey, Afghanistan. I'm trying to see, Afghanistan's over here. This is Greece over here. Anyway, gives you an idea what we're looking at. And this is really the first Western civilization. It happens here in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a region. Make sure you're clear on that too. It's not a country. It's not even a people. It is simply a region, like North America. It's just a region. So this entire region of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and this has got some of the early civilizations: Babylonia, Akkadia, Syria, Sumer. We're going to mention the Akkadians up here. Also got some of the first cities in the world. Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, and these are some of the very first cities on the planet as well, what we think of as a modern city. Anyway, gives you an idea of what we're looking at, we're going to be talking about for a while. Okay, this is what might have been an early home, Çatalhöyük. This was a place that was considered very metropolitan, Çatalhöyük. Let me look at my notes here, make sure I get it right. Okie dokie. Yes, it was in Turkey. That's where I thought it was. This is in modern-day Turkey, which is up here. Yeah, my slides are kind of operating funky. Sorry. Anyway, this is modern-day Turkey up here, Anatolia. Sometimes this is called Asia Minor. This is a peninsula here, Asia Minor, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Çatalhöyük was up here. Why is it significant? Because it was a place where we actually find evidence of multiple civilizations, multiple cultures, which meant this was a possibly cosmopolitan trade center. It was sort of in the middle of multiple empires at the time, and so we saw cross-cultural trade and contacts between different civilizations. This was a refuse pit. There was all kinds of waste. Basically, this was their garbage disposal. So in the middle of their house, they had a refuse pit, and maybe they had it covered or something, and that is where they would throw in all the garbage. Everything, all kinds of things were found in that refuse pit. And it's it's a model of what a home would have looked like back then. We think. Pretty simplistic, and yet utilitarian. It's got everything you need. It's got places to sit. It's got storage. It's got trash. I mean, it's got doorways. It's got a roof. Everything you need. All right. Continuing on section 1, we'll talk about the first cities in Mesopotamia, 4000 to 2300 B.C.E. These first cities in Western civilization developed in Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. How? Probably when they figured out how to raise crops off of the river, off of the two rivers. Let's see if they're on the map back here. Tigris and Euphrates. There it is. That's the two rivers. The Tigris River and the Euphrates River. That's the Fertile Crescent. It's sort of this crescent shape between the tip down here and goes up where the two rivers. Almost sort of makes like a triangle shape. And you have to sort of imagine it. And those are the two rivers, and all along these rivers is where all these first civilizations develop and these first cities develop. Agriculture was very significant. It created the economic basis for civilization because we now had food, and food could be used to have power, or even food could be traded for money, or food was used as money. For many farmers, they would pay their taxes in food. Whereas most common people didn't actually have money, as we would think about it. And this agriculture is used to create a large urban population. Large for this time period. I think there were some cities in Mesopotamia that were thought to maybe be as much as 40 or even 50,000 people, which at that time was a huge, huge city, considering most villages are normally, 100 people maybe, or 300 max. Mesopotamians built an intricate system of canals to irrigate all the waterways. So wherever the land was arid, which most of the land was arid, meaning it was very dry. It's not desert, but it gets very little rain. They would flood. The water would flood automatically because there's mountains all across this region. The snow would be up in the mountains. The snow would melt. The water would come rushing down. It would flood all these areas, and it would bring all the dirt and silt down with it from the mountains. And it had been doing this for probably millions of years. And so this was incredibly fertile land, hence Fertile Crescent. And humans learned to divert this water, to control this water, to capture this water, and then they were able to use that water to irrigate all the crops, to irrigate all the farms, and grow massive farms, to provide water for all the animals, the humans, and the crops. This is fresh water. This is snow melt. So it's all fresh water. As long as they captured it before it got to the ocean or the sea, it was all fresh water that they could use for crops, animals, and people, which is great. Of course, this creates a need for organized workforce to maintain all the canals, to build the canals. You need all the farmers. This, of course, promotes a centralized authority. Somebody has to organize all these people. You got thousands of workers and farmers and construction workers. You got to have someone organize, control all of this engineering work, all this processing, all this food gathering and food production and animal. It's requires people to run and organize all this, and this creates an authority. Someone has to be in charge. And it creates a centralized authority, he who controls the water and the food, and it was always a he. For pretty much all of world civilization, the people in power were always men. Only in rare instances do we see women in power. It's almost always men, male-dominated power and authority. We often call these city-states because they're not big enough to be countries or nations. They're pretty much a city, its walls, and the surrounding farmland. So they're independent little city-states. They're like little kingdoms. But they're really no bigger than a city and its surrounding farmland. That's all it is. But each one was independently ruled, most of them. Therefore, we call them a city-state. And in political terminology, a state is synonymous with the word country in modern society. So when you think of state, think about a little mini country that's just the size of a town. Kind of interesting. Large numbers of people. As I said, some of these might have reached a couple 10,000 people. This leads to the emergence of rulers. We see the first kings in Western civilization who are male kings that are ruling these societies. Some of the largest were Uruk and Ur. You saw those on the map. Those were some of the largest city-states, numbering in several 10,000. They lived in this hierarchical society with kings at the bottom, kings at the top, priests at the top, slaves at the bottom, soldiers more towards the top, farmers more towards the bottom. And yes, all early human societies around the entire globe had slaves. Slavery was actually common everywhere in the world until modern times. Slavery was a practice. It was practiced everywhere. Europe, Asia, Africa, America. It didn't matter. Slavery was common every place until modern times. The strict hierarchy leads to a monarchy. Most of these are monarchies. A monarchy is a hierarchical society led by a king. The king is usually divine in some way, meaning the king is thought to be associated with a god. Sometimes the king is thought to actually be part god. Sometimes the king is thought to be a god in human form. And sometimes the king is simply thought to be blessed by the gods. Either way, a monarchy is a king that is in some way or fashion divine, associated with the gods. Which is handy if you're a king, that you wanted to facilitate that idea that I'm divine, because, of course, who is never wrong? The gods. Gods are always right. So therefore, if I'm a king and I'm associated with the gods, and I claim that the gods give me power, therefore by association as the king, I must always be right. How convenient. Good to be king, I suppose. They lived elaborate lifestyles in palaces where they had advisors, they had servants, always men. There's no real evidence of a female monarch in Mesopotamian society, and they usually rose to power through warrior status. They usually were warrior kings. Might was the way you rose to power typically. The king usually, again, acknowledged there were gods that were above him or that he was associated with. And, of course, the gods allowed him to rule justly and fairly in the god's name, which also meant anything the king said went. Basically, the king's rule was law. The king's word was law. If the king said this, then that's the way it was. Because whatever the king says, it has to be blessed by the gods, or many times the king would also claim it was received by the god. Therefore, if the king says you have to do this or this, he can simply say, well, the gods told me that, therefore everybody must obey. Usually worked. The king was also supposed to protect the people from outside attacks, to make sure people didn't starve, to make sure the water kept flowing and the crops kept growing, make sure the climate stayed good. Of course, one of the ways a king could get deposed, removed from power, or simply assassinated, which did happen, is if the crops don't grow, the locusts come, the armies invade, etc., etc. Well, therefore, you must not be doing what the gods want, so we'll kill you and put somebody else in charge. That did happen. So as long as things were good, it was great to be king. You got everything. And you had all the power. But when things went bad, sometimes your head was the first one on the chopping block. All right, they built large temples. Again, their religion is heavily intertwined with their society. I'm not to cuneiform yet, so I'm getting there. So part of still staying on religion, they built these large temples known as ziggurats. And you could look that up as well in your book. Ziggurats. These ziggurats were a step pyramid. They were like a pyramid with levels, a pyramid with a level. And they built them so they could get close to the gods. The priests would often live up on top of the temples. They did do human sacrifices at times. They had servants and slaves, all to appease the gods. It should be noted, who didn't farm? The priests, the soldiers, the kings, the attendants, all the people who lived in the city, they didn't farm. Therefore, the farmers worked all the time, day and night, year-round, to produce all the food for everyone, including the thousands or tens of thousands of people that didn't actually farm. Another aspect of the division of labor. I'm a soldier, you're a farmer. I will never grow crops, you will never fight in a war. That's simple. Division of labor. That is a key aspect of modern civilization. We know they were polytheistic. Poly meaning many, theistic gods. They believed in many gods. Many, many different gods and spirits and religions and different levels of gods. There were higher gods and lower gods and demigods and etc., etc. Huge pantheon of different types of gods. All kinds of myths talked about how the gods were awesome and powerful, and they could do things, of course, incredible feats. They could do things human couldn't. If you made a god mad, they might destroy you or bring fires or plagues or storms. If you made the gods happy, they would bring wealth and status and lots of water. Religion really begins as a way to explain the natural world, the things we can't explain. How to explain earthquakes and comets and why your baby just dies, or why a cow just falls over dead, or why I fall over dead. It's just to explain all the things we couldn't explain at the time with there wasn't such a thing as science. But over time, they started using religion to explain all the unexplainables. Why did it rain this month, but it didn't rain last month? Well, we must have made the gods mad last month, and this month we made the gods happy. Things like that. The entire economy was pretty much run by the kings and the priests. They controlled the exchange of food, the exchange of goods. It's sometimes referred to as a redistributive economy. A redistributive economy. Simply put, the farmers grew the food, they gave it to the king and the priests, and the king and the priests would then distribute the food out. So they would redistribute it. It would go from the farms to the city, and then the city would determine who got the food. Therefore, who had the power? Whoever controlled the food. Because they could literally withhold food from you, and you would starve to death, your kids would die, because you didn't make the king happy, or you didn't make the priests happy, or the soldiers, etc. This applied to everything, though. This applied to food, but also applied to water. It applied to gold. It applied to treasure. We think the vast majority of the population were terribly poor. Very, very poor farmers that lived a very short life. Most of them dying before 30. Yeah. This was certainly a patriarchal society where if there was any power or status, it was always in the hands of men. We do believe that completely. The men controlled all of the economic, military, and political power, and this does become the standard in Western civilization until modern times. It still is today. Even though it needs to be different and women need to have a lot more power than they do, it doesn't change the reality that even in today, the majority of power held in the world is in the hands of men. It still is. It certainly has gotten better. It certainly has improved over the last 2 centuries, but it doesn't change that it still is that way. All right, and we also see the invention of the first writing in Western civilization, and that is what we call cuneiform. This is the first writing in Western civilization. This cuneiform And we think it had purely utilitarian reasons, probably to record taxes and accounting, basically to record who delivered their food, who paid taxes, how many soldiers were marching, salaries. It was purely for government and economic purposes. That was the reason. Someone had to keep track of who paid their food in taxes and who didn't pay their food, who didn't pay their taxes. Just that simple. And the way it was wet clay. They actually pushed symbols, what we call pictographs. They were pictures, like a symbol of a bird or a symbol of an eye or something like that, and they actually pushed it into wet clay with the tip of a bird feather, the sharp point of the bird feather. And then it would dry, and it would be dry as hard as stone. That's the only reason we still have any of it around. We do still have some cuneiform around that has survived, because once it dried, it was hard as a rock. Some of it has survived. There were only a handful of people who probably knew how to read and write, and either it was specifically, there is one other purpose. We do think some of the writings for religious purposes. So it was almost entirely for practical utilitarian, or maybe some religious purposes. But even then, it still might have been utilitarian, because they were recording who made donations to the temple, who gave their food or donations to the temple, which in other words was, if you went to the temple, it was supposed to imply that you were donating it to the gods. So who actually donated their whatever, their tithes, I guess is a word we'd use today, who tithed to the temple to appease the gods? So even there, it was for very practical purposes. It wasn't for recording scripture. There was nothing like what we think of as scripture in this time period. Nothing that, when we think about religion, has nothing to do with any scripture. It was, again, for practical purposes at this point in time. This is a ziggurat. Ziggurat at in Sumer. Was the city. Sumer was a city-state. Sumer is one of the early city-states. And this is a ziggurat. Pretty freaking impressive, to be honest. They were very impressive. They were building these long before they were building pyramids in Egypt. Pyramids are more impressive, don't get me wrong, but pyramids also come like 1,000 years after this, before they were building pyramids. And here's a truck, so you can see the size of how big the ziggurat is. This is a pickup truck right here. Pretty big things, pretty impressive. And the priests would live up here on top, along with their servants and slaves. And of course, people would bring everything to them, and they would be up there because they were closer to the gods. Quite interesting. Again, these are pictures that are probably in your book. This is cuneiform, gives you an idea of what it looked like in 3100 BCE. Carp being a fish. This sort of looks like a fish. This sort of looks like a plow. A cow, I don't know if you say so. Eat, bread, head. I mean, does that not look like a head? It looks like a human head. So the imagery wasn't like we think of as language. They were pictures that actually look like the words. And then if you knew the language, you would know this might meant the head of a person, or so many head of, I don't know what the hell, Go ask, what's it called when you study this? Linguistics? Go ask someone who studies linguistics. They can tell you all about it. But it gives you an idea of what their early language probably looked like, the first cuneiform around 3100 BCE. So this is really when history begins. Everything before 3000 BCE, which is 5,000 years ago, is prehistory. We don't really start history until writing begins. That's why, we've spent, 30 minutes on this, but the whole rest of the class is going to be actually history. This is all really prehistory up to this point, or before this time period. Anyway, and you can also see how it develops over time, how the imagery develops over thousands of years into modern type of language, the Neo-Assyrian language 2,500 years later. Very interesting how it does develop. Let's see what's next. Oh, okay, we'll start talking about metal. All right, so once we get to this time period, we're really talking about what we call the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is around this time period when it begins. So you have the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, up to about 10,000 BCE. And then from about 10,000 to 3,000 is the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. And then from about 3,000 for about the next 2,000 years, you have the Bronze Age, which this is because this is when they discover the first real human-produced metal, bronze. A bronze, which is an alloy, it's a mixture of, I believe copper and tin. It's probably in my notes somewhere, but I think so. Oh, there it is, copper and tin. We learned how to take two very soft metals, mix them together to make a very strong metal, bronze. And bronze is used for weapons, it's used for pottery, it's used for it's used to make pots, it's used for kitchenware, it's used for everything from a fork to a sword and everything in between. Alright, so this is really what we start calling the Bronze Age, this time period, 2350 for, till about 1500, something like that. We'll get that date more specific a little bit. Alright, the first empire really comes about as a result of bronze. That's how we get the first empire. Why? They get weapons, and they could use those powerful weapons to conquer their enemies. Before bronze, weapons were stone and wood and bone. Not very effective. Yeah, you can kill somebody with it, but not really effective to wage war. Alright, what is an empire? An empire is specifically a political state in which one or more formally independent peoples or territories are now ruled by one. Okay. Simply put, it is when one power or authority conquers smaller powers or authority and puts them all together and starts ruling all of them. So when one person takes over other groups of people and starts ruling them, and those people had been independent before, you have your first empire. These empires are pretty much always created through warfare. Warfare is going to be an incredibly common topic in this class. Not ever intended to glorify. War is a terrible thing. In certain periods of time, war is inevitable, and sometimes war is the only solution. But I would argue the vast majority of time, war is not necessary, and violence is not necessary. There's other ways to do it, although sometimes the most simple and expedient way is to simply go in and kill all of them. And that's what often happens. Politics and discussion and debate and compromise, those are the way things should always go. Sometimes they simply prefer to go in and kill everybody. That is how most empires, almost all empires, are formed in world history, is through violence, oppression, destruction, and that is pretty much the way almost all of these are formed. And this is certainly no different. The first one is one we'll call this Akkadian. This Akkadian empire probably formed around 2350 B.C.E., so that is 4,350 years ago. I'm going to stop saying that pretty soon. I just want to try and get that into your head. For some people, may still not be positive about the whole time thing. This is often what we call, again, the Bronze Age, primary metal used. Bronze was used to make weapons, but other things too. Luxury goods, tools, art, jewelry. All kinds of great luxury goods and tools, etc. These bronze metal goods, especially very fancy ones, were often status symbols. If you could afford a fancy weapon or fancy pottery or fancy jewelry, this was a status symbol. This indicated wealth and status and power. Bronze was not easy to make. It was expensive to make. And if you had all this bronze stuff, you were special. If you went around with any type of bronze armor, which at the time probably would have only been like a breastplate, maybe a shield, not like, don't think like knights in armor, none of that existed. It was like a couple little pieces of metal on you. That would be it. If you had that, you were high status. If you had bronze cookware, if you had bronze pots, if you had bronze jewelry, you were high status. Common people would have never ever seen bronze or ever used it. This nature of the status, which at this time, status had pretty much only been measured in land, food, animals. Now, status comes to also include metal goods. And metallurgy is what we call making metal, making different types. It's the science of metal, is this metallurgy. 2300 BCE, okay, there we go. The king at the time was King Sargon of Akkad. This was the city of Akkad. That's why we call it Akkadian Empire. This city of Akkad, the city-state, he goes, he uses force and power. In essence, what happens is he has trade contacts with many other city-states and realizes other city-states have things he wants. He builds up an army, and then he marches against those city-states, and instead of getting goods through trade, negotiation, compromise, or simply paying for it, he went and took it by force, and he creates the first empire in Western civilization. The Akkadian Empire, which is in Mesopotamia. We saw that on the map a little bit earlier, and of course you can rewind back to like the 10-minute mark or something like that, and you'll see the city of Akkad, which is up in the northern part of Mesopotamia. All right, his main goal was to get land, but this conquest actually in some ways helped civilization because it facilitated trade, the exchange of ideas and technology, spreads. By this point in time, we probably have literature of some sort. We have some writing, we have some books, some literature, we have music. We have lots of evidence that they played music. We don't have anything left. We don't have any written music, but we have imagery of them with musical instruments. So therefore, we know they played music, they had musical instruments, even though we don't have any actual records of the music. This helped spread their culture, religion into a larger area, and probably this empire of the Akkadians really creates this first cosmopolitan region, which means there's all kinds of peoples that speak different languages, different religious beliefs, worship different gods. So ultimately, it is good for civilization, certainly bad for all the people the Akkadians murdered, slaughtered, and enslaved. Which that is how empires are built. Murdering, burning cities, slaughtering innocents, including the soldiers, but also lots of innocents, and they always resulted in enslaving enemies. Always the way it was. The Akkadian Empire only lasted maybe 200 years. Maybe in the 2200s, 2150, 2200s, the Akkadian Empire collapses. So it lasted a short while, but it's very significant because it's the first one. It really sets a template for how most other empires are formed in Western civilization, and also for the way in which it spread ideas and culture and knowledge and religion all across Mesopotamia. It really created the largest numbers of interactions of all Mesopotamian civilizations up to this point. And Mesopotamian civilizations had probably, say it differently, Mesopotamian cities, towns, and cultures had probably existed for a couple thousand years by this point. So this first empire is very significant in different ways. Here you go. There's your Tigris and Euphrates. Akkad is up here, more in the northern part. And the Akkadian civilization is, I think this entire purple is considered maybe the Akkadian Empire. Which means at one point, look at it, everything, pretty much all of Mesopotamia was under the authority of the Akkadians for a while. All the way from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It was actually quite big. It is one of the larger empires in early Western history. It is, up until the Romans. It's not the largest, but it's one of the largest until we get to the Roman Empire, which is, of course, much later. But it also fell really quickly. It might have only held together for a century, as far as actually solidly held together. 2350, 2200. Yeah. Gives you an idea anyway, what we're talking about there. And if you do see on these early maps a question mark, that's because we're not 100% positive that is where the city of Akkad was. You got to understand, most of these cities have been buried under the sands of the Middle East for thousands of years in some cases. Plus, a very common practice in this time period was to build cities on top of cities. After one city had died out, the people had died out, maybe had been burned down, maybe they'd all been enslaved, someone else would come in and build another city on top of it. And on top and on top. Why did they always do that? Because the reason the city was built there in the first place. It probably was perfect location, access to water, access to land, access to underground water, reservoirs, The reason they built the city in the first place there was probably because it was a prime spot. Therefore, if the city's cleared out or burned down, destroyed, it's still a prime spot, which means someone else comes in and builds on top of it. A great example is the city of Troy. Troy was a real city. Yeah, lots of Troy is mythological. There were no gods or anything, but the actual reality is Troy was a real Greek city. We know Troy has been built over at least 12 times. So as they've excavated Troy and dug down over the last 100 and some years, they keep finding new levels, older and older cities. So there's at least 12 different cities that have built on that one same location of Troy. So we think that was pretty common. As a result of that, it sometimes makes it very hard to date cities or to find the exact location, because literally in 10 years from now, someone else might find another city that's actually earlier. And okay, maybe that was the city of Akkad. Anyway, it makes it a little difficult at times to really date and place things sometimes. Not to mention, the further back you go, the less writing you have available, and until eventually you get to a point where there is no writing, and you literally just have to guess. That is really the purview of, is that No, that's, I guess, archaeologists or anthropologists. Anthropologists, the ones that really have to figure that out. Beyond me. All right, next thing we'll talk about is the achievements of the Babylonians and the Canaanites. All right, we'll start. Okay, Canaan is the region of what is modern-day Israel. Gives you an idea. Babylonia is this region. Babylonia is right in here. So Babylonia is in here close to Akkad, and then Canaan is over here. Canaan is over on the edge of the Mediterranean, what is sort of modern-day Israel, the Canaanites. Don't get them confused. I don't believe the Canaanites are Jewish. They're not the Jewish people, I don't think. We'll see as I get into my notes here in case that rings a bell, but I don't believe so. But anyway, that's the general region, is the Canaanite over here, and then Babylon is in here in the region close to where Akkad is thought to be. So the Babylonians and the Canaanites, 2000 to 1000 B.C.E. We see innovations in the areas of law, commerce, learning, which have very lasting influences. Law, commerce, and learning, very lasting influences on Western civilization. Many kings who were often thought to be monarchs, divine power, they felt they had to protect their subjects. One of the most significant kings at the time, let's see if he's on here. I don't have him on here. I'll give you his name. I don't have him on my slide. I thought I did. It's King Hammurabi. King Hammurabi, who ruled around 1792 to 1750. 1792 to 1750 B.C.E. That's King Hammurabi. He ruled over Babylon. He created a code of laws, sometimes known as Hammurabi's Code, which was the first written Western code of law. Very significant. It is sort of a basis for all law. All Western law can be seen in it. It's also a basis for Jewish law. That can be contested and debated. But if you were to look at Jewish, the Old Testament, and you see lots of writings in the Old Testament, you can see they mirror Hammurabi's code, sometimes almost word for word. And we do know somewhere around this time period, Jewish people were actually in captivity. They were actually kept as slaves of the Babylonians. So we think it's very likely a lot of learning they received, a lot of knowledge they got, they actually borrowed from the Babylonians. So Hammurabi's Code has been heavily influential upon religious law, and that would be sacred, and also secular law, which is non-sacred. Very interesting. His law is usually focused on family issues, commercial issues, and listing crimes. One of the biggest things you could do was to hurt another family member or to steal something. These codes were thought to protect the weaker people in society, but it also divided Babylon into a caste system, sort of. It divided Babylonian peoples into a different hierarchical system to where either you were a free person, a commoner, or a slave. Now, you might think commoner and free would be the same. They're not. Free would be Babylonian citizens, which was actually a small population. Commoners would be everyone else who was free but not Babylonian, which meant all the conquered peoples, because they didn't enslave everybody, but all the conquered peoples, and then of course you have all the slaves. It also divided the rules between men and women. Men had certain rules and laws apply to them. Women had other certain ones that applied to them. So you see, it divided you based upon status, also based upon gender. Men were not treated as harshly with the laws as women. A really good example of status with the laws is a poor person, a commoner, or a slave that stole bread would have their hand cut off. A rich person simply had to pay a fine. So this disparity between rich and poor, have and have not, status and those that lack status, has always been part of Western civilization. Until modern times, still is. So this creation of a society where some people are held in higher status and have more importance than others, it's always been this way. Sometimes we refer to this as an eye for eye code. Again, you steal food, you steal something with your hand, it gets cut off. But literally, the eye for an eye is in the Hammurabi's code. If you take out the eye of your neighbor has the right to take your eye out. It's literally, that's where it comes from. It's in the code. Stuff like that. Let's look at Canaan a little bit. Mesopotamian cities. I don't really have anything in Mesopotamian cities. I think... No, not really anything on Mesopotamian cities. Not really that much on it. Anything I haven't already talked about. I guess I should say those laws pretty much only applied in the cities. He actually wrote the laws down, too, which also is really unique. He had the laws written down, chiseled into stone, on the walls around Mesopotamia. Actually had it chiseled into stone on markers out in the countryside. So even when you were traveling in the countryside, you would be able to stop and read these laws and actually see what the rules were in the city you were approaching, what you could do or couldn't do, based upon your status and gender. Even though it wasn't really fair, it is a huge leap forward in civilization. This idea of creating laws for everybody, publishing the laws for public consumption, and having laws that actually treated everybody somewhat equally. Much more so than ever before. All right, we'll look at Canaan a little bit. Canaan grew very wealthy through trade. They were probably a merchant empire, trading treasure over ships. Again, they were right on the border of the Mediterranean, so probably a lot of their connections came by ship. They sent out boats and they traded. They also developed the Canaanite alphabet, which is pretty much the basis. It's hard to say exactly. It's the basic basis for modern alphabetic systems. Not specifically ours, English, but it is how all modern alphabetic systems develop outside of East Asia. East Asia is different. And a few little isolated pockets in the world of indigenous peoples, like Indian type peoples in a few places in the world. But other than that, pretty much all modern language owes itself to Canaanite. Canaanite is the first language that actually developed where a single letter had a single sound associated with it, which is how our modern language works. S, S, P, P, D, D. So we have a letter and a sound association. This is the first language to do that. And that is how all modern language is, with the exception of East Asian languages. That's it. So yeah, this develops probably around 1600 BCE, and of course, incredibly significant and influential. That's pretty much modern world languages. Let's see what else, if there's anything in here. Nope. Yeah, my slides are working kind of weird. I'm sorry, they're kind of glitchy right now. But yeah, we're working through it. This alphabet This alphabet proved very efficient, very adaptable, much better than pictographic writing, much better than cuneiform or hieroglyph, which we're going to talk about next. And this does really become the basis for modern language systems, is this Canaanite alphabet. So incredibly significant, whether it's law, alphabet, language, writing, culture, how the economics work, how hierarchical, status, slavery, literally the list goes on. Almost everything which becomes standard in Western civilization for the next 4,000 years really begins in Mesopotamia. For good and bad. Don't get me wrong, some of it's bad. Slavery, for instance. Some of it is bad, but it doesn't change that it still becomes the basis for pretty much almost anything we can think of, all the way to modern times of Western civilization. It all really began here. All right, next thing we should look at then is Egypt. Now we're going to switch to the next major region of early civilization, Egypt. So civilization in ancient Egypt revolved around one river, the Nile River in northern Africa. And the fertility that its annual flood provided to the surrounding farmland. Very similar. So we had the mountains in Central Africa, the snow would melt, all of that water would rush down the river, and it would flood out into the Nile Delta, out into the Mediterranean. And this would bring down all the sediment and dirt, as it had probably been doing for millions of years, and that also made all of the land near the Nile River, all the way down its length, incredibly fertile, perfect for growing crops and food. Very similar to with the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. We divide Egypt into 3 time periods. Very simple. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So we're looking at the Old Kingdom here. From the unification of Egypt to the Old Kingdom, 3050 BCE to 2190 BCE. These 3 kingdoms, the Old, the Middle, and the New, span over 2,000 years. And what's really so significant is over these 2,000 years, the actual culture of Egypt didn't really change. What was Egyptian in 3000 BCE was very much what was Egyptian in 1000 BCE, which is very unique, that their culture really didn't change dramatically or significantly over thousands of years. We start with King Narmer. King Narmer, he was a powerful monarch. He claimed to reign with divine authority, very common. He united Egypt into a single kingdom around 3050. Now, these dates early on like this, before we really have a written record, are, they might be, you might want to preface them with the term circa. Circa meaning around. So circa 3050. Is around the time that this kingdom was formed. Around 3050. I'm going to come back to this, look at a map here, just so you can see what we're talking about. So the Old Kingdom, you have little contradictory dates here, but we really look at the original unification of Egypt around 3050, and then the Old Kingdom forming around, 2700 BCE? And that was this dark green area on the Nile River, all the way here, almost to Nubia. Nubia will play a role later, not quite, but almost to Nubia. And as you can see, the kingdom just follows the river. Because once you get away from the river, it's just desert. It's just desert and wasteland and almost uninhabitable, except for a select few people. Until you get down here to the Nile Delta, and then there's a lot more land, which is arable land that can be, crops can be grown on, animals can live on, and then of course you have the Mediterranean Sea here, which has lots of access to resources and trade. But it gives you an idea what we're talking about here. This is still where modern day Egypt is today. 5,000 years later, the country of Egypt is here. The Red Sea, Mediterranean right here. So this is northern Africa. The Arabian Peninsula over here, Mediterranean, Europe is up here on the other side. And so Mesopotamia, which we talked about just a little bit ago, would be off over here. And then, of course, you have Canaan right here, the region we also spoke about briefly. This prime location of Egypt on the Nile was incredibly significant. Incredibly significant. It allowed them to trade up and down the Nile River. It also allowed them to trade in the Mediterranean and, of course, any other civilizations that were connected to the Mediterranean, and there were several. So this gave Egypt a very prime position to trade with other cultures, to have access to knowledge, religion, technology, metal making, weapon technology, all kinds of things. So they had access both north and south, and really once you went along the coast of Mediterranean, they really had access east and west to other cultures. But it also protected them, because to get to Egypt really required you to go across vast swaths of desert or to bring an army by ship, which they didn't really do back then. So this is another reason Egypt was able to maintain its culture and borders for so many centuries, was it was really protected. No one could march an army across the Sahara Desert to get to the Egyptians. It was basically impossible. And people didn't march armies or send armies by ship back then. Ship technology really wasn't that advanced. They were small ships that carried a few people or a few dozen people. They were not good for carrying soldiers and armies. So it really protected them a lot. Egypt also had the luck of having a lot of metal deposits. In the deserts right outside of the Nile, Egypt was able to find every type of metal deposit it could want. Tin and copper and gold and eventually iron and other things, which allowed them to really move into a metal age and to have access to metallurgy. Really gave them a distinct advantage. It really did. And you put all this together with how the river and the Nile enriched all the land, and really economically, materially, Egypt was rich with everything it could ever need to form a successful, thriving civilization, which is exactly what it did. Very productive and allows a very large population. Egyptian population was probably much greater than Mesopotamia. Probably. We know at the height, some Egyptian cities probably had tens, maybe even 100 or 1,000 more people. So, yeah, potentially much bigger, much greater access, and a lot fewer competitors. The Mesopotamians were always competing with each other. Egypt is generally unified. For much of its time period, much of its history, it is unified as one nation. That same region in Mesopotamia was half a dozen different city-states or empires. That stability, don't get me wrong, Egypt had wars and violence, as we'll talk about, but generally Egypt was stable for most of its history, which allowed it to really become prosperous. They probably learned about writing from the Mesopotamians. They developed their own very ornate pictographic language, which we'd call hieroglyphs, which is really, again, hieroglyphs is just pictures. If they want to show a bird, they draw a bird. If they want to show an eye, they draw an eye. They want to show a person walking, they draw a foot. So it's a pictographic language. It's not cuneiform. They're definitely different. But we think that they probably learned the idea of language from the Mesopotamians. Probably. Not one of those things were 100%, but probably. They wrote, again, very much early on, very utilitarian, military records, government records, official records, things like that. And there was a handful of educated people who were called scribes, who could actually read and write. Very small group of people. Religion and the consequences of religion really, really guide Egyptian culture. Religion was much more integral to Egyptian society than Mesopotamians. Mesopotamian religion was really a side thing. It was really just a side concern, was religion. Egypt, religion was core to their entire society. Their entire culture was really based around their religious beliefs. Much more so than the Mesopotamians. Very central role. The king was considered divine. His power depended on his possessing Mot. His possessing Mot. What is Mot? Well, the way we define it as best we can is this divine essence or divine knowledge that the king would have. And of course, he had it because the king was divine. He was part God. or descended from gods. Therefore, he was thought to simply have Mot. So his ability to understand the laws of the universe, divine justice, and specifically, most importantly, the flooding of the Nile River. Because that flooding which occurred every year is what allowed Egypt to survive. That water, that fresh water that came down and watered the crops, fed the animals, every single year is the only reason Egypt survived. If that flooding had ever stopped, if all of that water coming rushing down every spring from the snows in the mountains had ever just not come, and, there were some years, there were droughts that it really didn't come, or there was little due to a heat wave or something, Egypt suffered dramatically. To fulfill his obligations as king and rule according to Mot, he had to maintain the goodwill of the gods towards the people and for the people. He had to, the king was given the authority to make all laws, of course, because he spoke with the gods. Therefore, whatever the king said was law, because I guess the idea was that any law he made was handed down to him by the gods. All kings in this time period usually used a very similar type of rationalization to where you obey what the king says at all times. His rule is ultimate and uncontested. He was also thought to keep the balance of nature. Somehow he was supposed to balance nature, the good, the evil, through prayer, through sacrifices. Egyptians did sacrifices. Maybe even human sacrifices, although we don't think that was a core of their religion, human sacrifice. We know that there's records, there's evidence that Egyptians and Mesopotamians both did human sacrifice at different times, although it was not core. It didn't seem like it was a common thing. Usually it would probably be sacrificing their enemies. Like they went to war, and then to appease the gods, hey, we won the war, here's 1,000 of their soldiers, and we'll slaughter them and kill them for the gods. But human sacrifice probably wasn't like a common everyday practice in either society, but it did occur. They often would wage war on their enemies. The Egyptians would often go to war on enemies they could get close to. Usually this war involved either the northern tip of the Nile or the southern part. In other words, the northern part by the Mediterranean where they could go close to the water and stay close to the water and then attack, the Assyrians or something. Or the southern tip where they could go to war with the Nubians. Along the length of the Nile, they didn't go to war with anyone, because every direction for hundreds of miles was just desert. But at the top and the bottom, there were opportunities to engage with other cultures and peoples, and they did go to war. They made weapons, they used war chariots, things like that. They certainly did that, although they probably borrowed the chariots from the Assyrians, for instance. Let's see what else I want to talk about that. Very strong belief in the afterlife. This is the first society we have to where we have actually written records specifically talking about the afterlife. They even wrote a book, which we do, I believe we have a copy of it. I think you can actually find a record of it. You look on the internet, known as the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, contrary to the mummy movies, Hollywood mummy movies, the Book of the Dead was simply instructions on how to prepare bodies, rituals for the afterlife. Egyptians heavily believed in this idea of another world after our world. They built these elaborate tombs we know about. We know in later years they built these elaborate pyramids, which really what a pyramid is, it's simply a tomb. It's simply an above-ground tomb that is meant to somehow focus the power of the kings to a point at the top to somehow connect them to the gods. Kings were often thought to ascend to godhood after death. They spent vast resources, money, food, manpower, stuff like that, to build these massive tombs. Don't get me wrong, there were thousands of tombs built. The ones that were most obvious are the pyramids, but there were lots of tombs built underground. They literally just found one, a brand new, within the last couple months. They found a brand new unopened tomb that is thought to be 2,000 years old. Never been opened to the air. They just found it recently. So they're still finding these tombs in Egypt, and they'll still continue finding them, probably as they grow and develop northern Africa. As cities expand and grow and they dig into the ground, they'll probably continue to find more tombs. You got to consider they were burying people in tombs for thousands of years. There's who knows how many tombs buried under the sands in northern Africa that have never been found. There you go. Go become an Egyptologist. It's an official degree. You can get Egyptologist, and you can go and study Egypt and study the tombs and study the pyramids. If you want to travel to Egypt, seems like a pretty fun job. Indiana Jones, anybody? Early on, lots of kings did display their wealth in huge pyramids, these big complexes. Some of them were built like underground cities. Really complicated. Lots of tunnels and passageways, tombs and traps. And yes, these tombs did have traps. They had acid traps. They had spike traps. They had blocks that would drop. They had fake floors that would actually collapse. Because there was a belief, because they always buried their kings with treasure and wealth and gold and gems and all kinds of stuff, there was a strong belief that tomb robbers would try to break into them. And they did. That's why most tombs have not been found intact over the years, because most tombs haven't broken into. If anyone could find the tomb, they broke into it, because it always had treasure in it. But they did indeed have actual traps. And of course, they mummified the bodies. They mummified them inside the tombs, inside the pyramids. They had large funerals and ceremonies, often buried with these treasures. Of course, it wasn't good to be a servant of a high-status person, because they often buried them alive. The person would die, they would bury alive the servants and even the animals. They'd bury them alive with their animals, their horses, their servants, and seal them up in there, airtight. Because you needed all those servants and animals in afterlife. Yeah, not good. Not good to be a servant or a slave of a high-status individual buried in a tomb. And it wasn't always just kings. If you were wealthy, you could simply be buried in a more common tomb. If you could afford to build a tomb, you could build one. And you could get put into one. Pyramids, of course, were for the high-status kings. Later they use the term you're more familiar with, probably pharaohs. They used that later on. Very structured, hierarchical structured. Men and women maintained a relative equal status, though, under the laws. And we do have records. We have a huge amount of records of hieroglyphs. More so than any other civilization at this time. Because they carved and wrote everything on stone. And, of course, much of Egyptian stonework is still accessible. And due to the hot, dry climate, a lot of it didn't decay. So we still have a lot of records. So we believe the laws treated men and women pretty fairly. Women could get divorces. Women could even sue their husbands. There's again, legal records. That's one of the records we do find, some legal records, laws and stuff. Possibly of any early society, was women had the most equality in Egypt. Possibly. Some Egyptologists have even gone so far as to say, up until literally the last century or two, maybe the most fair gender society in Western civilization was Egypt. Women had high status. We had female queens. We had Egyptian queens. We had Egyptian female pharaohs. Only a couple, but there was a handful of them. Women were held, I guess, it has probably to do with the afterlife, because reproduction was considered such a significant role in their society. Women were given high status due to their role in reproduction. And there were many female gods, and female gods were thought to be very powerful. Interesting society. Very classist. So your status probably was much more significant on your life than your gender. As opposed to many societies, gender was maybe as significant. They created art, literature. They had a certain interest in maintaining relations with the gods, of course. They believed family life was really important. A lot of images we have left depict Egyptian families. Women displayed prominently. So families, having kids, reproduction. Very much. Very much. And we also see a lot of similarities here with early Jewish writings and teachings and Jewish culture. Probably as well, because we do believe the Jewish people were also held in captivity in Egypt. They were kept as slaves in Egypt for a few centuries. Even though this is in Jewish scripture, historically, there's a lot of evidence for it. So, historically speaking, Jewish people were indeed probably kept as slaves of the Egyptians for many years. and the Babylonians for many years. And as a result, when the Jewish people do finally write down their scripture after this time period, it's another 1,000 years before Jewish people write anything down. Once they do write down their scripture, there's a lot of things in it which reflect Egyptian and Mesopotamian society. Because combined between the two, the Egyptians probably spent the better part of 400 years. The Jewish people spent as captives or slaves of both the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So we see lots of influences on Western culture and society of these early civilizations, far more than just the obvious. Let's see what else we have here. We have Remembering the Dead, Ancient Egypt. We see the hieroglyphs, all kinds of hieroglyphs. You can see there's like birds and different animal figures. So we have hieroglyphs here. We have hieroglyphs over here. There's even a little bit over here cut off. Let's see. We have animal heads on some of the imagery. Anytime you see a human with an animal head, that's supposed to represent a god. So this was a god of, I don't know, hyenas here, hyena god or something. Each god was usually represented by a particular animal. You know, like cats, for instance. I think that was Set or Bastet, one of those. And, you know, that was a crime. It was a high crime for killing a cat. You could be executed because cats were thought to represent a particular god or goddess. They brought animals for sacrifice. This is animals being brought for sacrifice. They did often sacrifice animals. It was really common. We see musical instruments in this imagery, so we know they played music. We see virgin priestesses dressed in white. That imagery right there, virgin priestesses, as the person's being mummified here. So this shows the people, the servants, the slaves, animals being sacrificed, the gods, all holding this one person. It's all focused on this one, probably a king or a pharaoh, the reverence for this one high-status person. Even the gods come down from the heavens to help prepare this person for the afterlife. This would have been a very high-status individual of some sort, or at least whoever drew this imagery held this person in high status. Really interesting. It says a lot about the culture. And we have what's the word I'm looking for? Translated. We've translated all Egyptian hieroglyphs. So we know, I don't know what this says. Your book might tell you. But we know what all Egyptian hieroglyphs say. It's been fully translated. So we have the full Egyptian language, ancient Egyptian language translated. So that's handy. That's really useful. So when we look at this imagery, we're not guessing. We actually know exactly what it is and what it represents. That can't be said about all early civilization. There's actually a lot of early imagery that we have to sort of guess, that we aren't always sure about. But this is one that we are. Let's see what's next. Here we see Egypt, ancient Egypt. We have Nubia down here. The Great Sphinx. This is actually some controversy right now. Just in the last couple of years, there's been some controversy about the Sphinx that actually, there's some Egyptologists that claim it's actually much older than we thought it was. Right now, we think it was built sometime around the pyramids, and you can actually see the edge of a pyramid back here. But there has been some Egyptologists recently that have said that they think this might actually be 2,000 years earlier, which would, if that's the case, make it the oldest structure in human history. But that is still debatable. And that's sort of Egyptology. One thing about Egyptology, which is kind of really interesting, even though it's studying things from thousands of years ago, it's a constantly evolving science because we keep finding new things. The more and more they expand and develop in Northern Africa, they keep stumbling upon new things. And you got to consider much of Northern Africa is still empty desert. And many of those places out there is where they built these tombs and whatnot. So, yeah. It's a constantly evolving thing, even though it's thousands of years old. Kind of neat. Nonetheless, it's pretty impressive. It's the body of a lion, and this was probably thought to be the head of probably a pharaoh of some sort, maybe a powerful king. Probably. We have not identified. There's never been a definitive decision whose face this is. Probably at some point there might have been writing on it somewhere. But, of course, this was exposed to the elements for thousands of years, and it's all been faded and gone, long gone. So no one has any idea whose face this is supposed to be. But It's interesting. I don't know if it's technically one of the wonders of the world, but hey, it should be one of the wonders of the ancient world. This shows you hieroglyphic language. I'm not going to spend any time on this. Just gives you an idea of how it's pictograph. That represents a vulture. This represents an owl. Go figure. This represents water, wavy lines. Hey, there you go. You know, pool, hill. Interesting stuff. You know, and and the reason how it become a language is they would mix things together to make different. Like the symbol of a triangle would represent a woman, or a V would represent a woman, and then a hill, like this circle, would represent a hill or something. And if they put the V and the hill together, that would represent a woman from a far distance, or a woman from another village or something, implying literally a woman from across the hill. So where they would mix and match all the different pictographs, and you get a language. It makes a language. By interpreting how the different pictographs are placed together would actually make a language. Really interesting. So let's see, the Middle and New Kingdoms, climate change, altered the flood patterns. We think this is what instigated a change to a new kingdom. The flood patterns change. We think climate change meant the less water coming down the Nile, which meant, of course, they lost confidence in their kings and rulers. Probably uprising, revolts, riots, other people rising to power claiming they could bring back the water, things like that. This probably led to a civil war, and this is what we think destroyed the Old Kingdom, somewhere in the early 2000s. This is B.C.E., remember this is B.C.E., so we think this is probably what destroyed. So this period of instability from around 2200 to 2061, this period of civil war violence lasted over 100 years, and Egypt probably fell apart into different pieces. It ripped apart Egypt, and then finally they put it back together around 2061, and we get what we call the New Kingdom, which is the next Egyptian dynasty. This restores authority of the monarchy. It pushes the boundaries of Egypt. It actually grows Egypt. Egypt becomes bigger. If you remember that map, and you can look back at it, if you want to go back and look at that map, you'll actually see the New Kingdom is even bigger than the Old Kingdom. So they finally put it back together, they reunify, and they expand. They actually are a greater empire. Or, they're not really an empire. They're really a civilization, but they're not an empire. Because an empire requires you to conquer other peoples. At this point in time, Egypt really hadn't conquered anyone. Pretty much everyone who was in Egypt, it was Egypt. They were all Egyptian. So it really wasn't an empire at this point in time. It does expand trade into Asia, Europe, and it really ushers in a new golden age. So by the 1900s BCE, we have this golden age of Egypt. This lasts for several centuries, and then it falls probably around 1665, and for the next 100 years, we have another period of civil war, instability, violence, to where there's multiple kings, multiple kingdoms. Egypt fractures into pieces again. Happens again. All right, so we get about 100 years, and we see kings from the city of Thebes. The city of Thebes actually form another new kingdom. The New Kingdom. This is the third kingdom. We had the old, middle, and the new. So we had another 100 years of instability. We have another new kingdom here. They create central authority. They promote a new sense of national identity. They take away the power from all the local small kings, and they make it into another centralized authority and a centralized kingdom, focused at the city of Thebes, though, as the capital. They generally believed that small local rulers had too much power, and all the power should be in the hands of one. And this is actually when they start calling them pharaohs. So the term pharaoh really doesn't come about until the New Kingdom. This is when there's a belief that there must be one king with all authority over everyone. Now, why is that different? How's that different? Well, number one, Egypt's much bigger now. Egypt has expanded. It's almost twice as big as it was in the Old Kingdom. So it's much more land. It also has expanded all the way down to Nubia now. So now we could really start calling it an empire because it has actually started to conquer other peoples. Egypt has now expanded over towards the Canaan region. Egypt has expanded down into Nubia. It is finally like an official empire because it is conquering neighboring peoples up along the Mediterranean and down along the Nile River. And they start calling them some pharaohs. Lots of foreign wars. We see lots of slaves. Egypt had a lot of slaves due to their wars. They gained territory, they gained power, they gained superiority. And for the first time, we see the kings actually take the fight to others, which is unique. Up to this point in time, in both the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, Egypt had really only been the focus of other attacks, other cultures attacking them. Now we actually get a situation where Egypt goes on the offense. Egypt actually attacks other peoples and other cultures. We see Egypt taking their war chariots, which they probably learned from the Assyrians how to make, and they attack other populations along the Mediterranean. They attack other populations down into Africa. The pharaohs were really warrior kings. This, interesting, is actually much more similar to what we saw in, say, the Akkadian Empire. And it's actually a similar time period. So this is much more what we have in this time period is Egypt becoming an expanding, growing empire, trying to dominate its surrounding neighbors. Prior to this time period, for the past 15 centuries, Egypt had pretty much been very isolationist, keeping to themselves, maintaining their own culture, and hadn't really wanted to interact with other peoples beyond trade. They didn't want immigrants coming in. If anyone did come in, they usually tried to enslave them to ensure that they were held as lower status than the Egyptians themselves. Interesting. We see slaves and farmers build these massive tombs, temples, palaces. They're not really building any more pyramids, but they're now building large temple complexes, palaces, underground tombs that are even bigger than the pyramids. Not tall, but as far as spread out, they're building these huge royal complexes that are the size of small cities. And literally, they're just to hold all the treasure, wealth, and armies, and soldiers, and priests of the pharaoh. They had lots of wealth in the form of slaves, gold, ivory, wine, anything they could get from the Mediterranean or Central Africa. This all went into the hands of the pharaohs and the other royalty being the other upper classes, and of course the priests. Very important status in society was being a priest. They wanted Egypt to look bigger, better, more powerful. And yeah, religion is still very significant. Religion is very significant in the New Kingdom. They actually, at one point, even created new gods. Amun-Re or Amun-Ra, which is sort of a combination of multiple gods. Religion changed a little bit. Worshipping other gods. Most homes had their own chapels, their own word. They had their own little prayer sites. They would have their own prayer areas within homes. They'd have a place where they would pray, a little altar may be a better word. And they had gods. They actually had symbols of gods. They had little statues of gods. Religion was incredibly significant. Most families had a personal god. We don't know how many gods existed in Egypt, but I've heard the idea of over 2,000 different types of gods, because gods and spirits and every type of animal would have a god associated with it. So, yeah, pretty much there was a god for everyone's needs. Anything you needed or wanted, you could find a god for it in some way or another. Not uncommon in many early societies. Very concerned with the afterlife, of course. We see an interesting thing in the New Kingdom. We see a lot of common people focused on the afterlife. We see common people getting buried in tombs or even getting mummified if they can afford it or get it done. We see a big focus. And this is also when the Book of the Dead is written. The Book of the Dead is an actual book that is thought to have been copied hundreds of times or thousands of times, and many people had copies of them in their own homes. And it was giving you all the things you needed to do to go to the afterlife. Basically all the rules. This was very utilitarian. Don't think of this as like Christian scripture or religious scripture about parables and how to be a good person. No, this was basically how to prepare bodies, what to do and what to say, what rituals to say. It was almost, think of it more like a medical manual than religious scripture. All the very important, significant things you had to do to ensure you got into the afterlife. And if you made any mistakes, forget it. You were done. You wouldn't go. You wouldn't get in there. So yeah, magic was also very significant. Magic and religion are probably very intertwined. And in truth, the idea of magic is probably more in line with what we would think of as modern religion. Their religion back then was almost a science, it was much more scientific than we would think of religion. But magic was important to them. Spells and prayers and stuff like this was very significant to them. So magic and religion live side by side and serve different purposes. Yeah, mummies should be buried with the Book of the Dead as well, a copy of it or pages from it. Very interesting stuff. Oh, in case you ever wondered how people are mummified, oh my gosh, have you ever looked that up? It was terrible. I mean, it would stick like these hooks down your nose and pull out all your organs. They would like do incisions in your body and they would try to leave your body intact. The idea was to leave your body physically intact because you were supposed to wake up in the afterlife. And they would take your body, all your organs, all your important stuff, your brain and everything, and they'd put it in these jars, and they'd sit these jars next to your body. With the idea being you're going to wake up in the afterlife, you're going to take these jars and I guess somehow reabsorb your organs into your body. I don't know how it worked. And then you go on living your life in whatever this next life was. Interesting stuff. And yes, there was punishments for high crimes. You could be mummified alive. But it wasn't, you did not get the proper rituals. You weren't given rituals. In essence, you were cursed. It was a form of punishment. Pretty rare, though. Pretty rare. There's only minimal evidence for that ever happening. A few isolated instances. So yeah, mostly mummification was as a way of it was a reward. It was a good thing. Mummification was a good thing. It wasn't something typically used as a crime or punishment. It was a good thing because then you would go to the afterlife. You'd be prepared. Your body. Quite interesting stuff. Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. Certainly one of the places if you ever travel to Europe, to Africa. I'd love to go. Never know. One of these days. Pretty impressive. Pyramids of Egypt. Let's see if I have something about that in my notes. I don't think I do, actually. No, I don't have anything about that. It's a cool image, though. All right. I'm going to skip the Hittites and the Minoans, even though it's fun stuff. Can't cover everything. So I'm not going to talk about the Hittites, really. The Minoans are sort of the pre-Mycenaeans. So I'm going to talk about the Mycenaeans. And then who are the Mycenaeans? The Mycenaeans are the pre-Greeks. So we have the Minoans, which are sort of the pre-Greeks. Then you have the Mycenaeans, which are the pre-Greeks. And the reason I'm going to talk about the Mycenaeans is because we're going to spend, let's put it this way. I think we have 3 chapters on the Greeks. 3 full chapters just on Greek society. Something like that. Or 4. Yeah. We spend half of this semester talking about the Greeks and Romans. Literally like 8 weeks. We'll talk about Greeks and Romans. So hopefully you like the Greeks and Romans. We're going to spend a lot of time on it. And the Mycenaeans are the pre-Greeks. So that's a good reason we want to spend at least a few minutes talking about them. So now we've gone from Mesopotamia, which is Fertile Crescent. We've gone over to Egypt, which is the northern Africa. And now we're going across the Mediterranean, or into the Mediterranean. And we're going to talk about the early Greeks, which we are the Mycenaeans. All right, this is the first civilization in Greece. Don't get me wrong, there have probably been people living in Greece for hundreds or thousands of years. But this is the first civilization. This is really when we have the first major cities. Remember, in all these places, did suddenly people spring up in Egypt in 3000 BC? Of course not. There have been people living in northern Egypt for thousands of years. But this is when civilization occurs, which is when they start building cities. They have a language. They have an identifiable culture, religion. They start having a hierarchical society. They have domesticated crops. They've domesticated animals. They learn how to control their environment by building irrigation and canals. It's civilization. There have been people living there for thousands of years. Same way in Greece. But this is when we have the first civilization, the first actual cities and culture and language and trade, and the first rulers, and a hierarchical society develops. That's what makes this different. That's what these time periods we look at. So the first civilization in Greece, which is on the southern edge of Europe. Everyone's familiar with Italy, the boot. Well, it's just to the east of that. It's the little peninsula that sticks out on the east of Italy. Mostly, this civilization develops around the site of Mycenae. That's what we call it. We don't know what they called it. We call it Mycenae. That was the city, which was the center of this new civilization. And this is on the peninsula of southern Greece, which you'll see on the map. There we go. Go back. There we go. So this is Anatolia. This is Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, right here. Just so sort of putting in perspective, the Canaanites are down here, and down here, of course, is Egypt, Africa. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. So you have Mesopotamia way over here. You have Egyptians right here, and this is here. Okay. Now, the one we skipped is Minoa. Minoans developed down here on the island of Crete. Not going to really talk about those right now. This is the forerunners of Greece. There's the city of Mycenae. This is a peninsula, actually. It looks like an island. It's not. It's connected right here. Barely, but it's connected. So this is actually a peninsula on Europe. This is Europe up here. And over here is Italy. So this is all one connected peninsula. It's not an island, even though it might look like it at first. And this is where the Mycenaean civilization develops. Very mountainous, very limited resources. Very significant. They were always looking for resources, always looking for opportunities, and always looking for a fight. When you have very little, you're always looking to get more. And if your neighbors aren't willing to give it over to you, and most of them aren't willing just to give you what they've got, the only way you get it is by force. The Mycenaeans were incredibly warlike. The Greeks were incredibly warlike. Most of these were city-states. These small little independent city-states, little kingdoms, most of them ruled by their own little king, their own ruler, their own ruling family, and it might just include 10 or 20,000 people living in the town and the surrounding farmland. City-states. Very much like Mesopotamia. They depended on the sea for most of their food. Because Greece is so mountainous and so rocky, there isn't many places to grow food. So most of their food and resources came from the water, the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Or even the local seas. You have the Aegean over here, the Ionian over here. But I mean, all of it is really connected to and part of the greater Mediterranean. And they constantly were vying for control of the land, fierce competition for the land, the resources, all around them. They were ruled by kings who regularly went to war, pretty much against anyone, really. Pretty much anyone they could run into that they think they could steal or take something from, they went to war with. Mycenaeans were incredibly aggressive. We have a lot of records from Mycenae. We have lots of grave goods, lots of archaeological evidence that tells us the Mycenaean people were warlike, constantly going to war and fighting. They had probably the most advanced weapons or fighting skills in this part of the world, which makes sense. If you're constantly fighting and going to war and constantly being aggressive with your neighbors, you develop better ways to do this. So it's not surprising that they were maybe the most advanced military group in this part of the world. We have lots of records that indicate the Mycenaeans also operate under redistributive. In other words, the kings gathered all the resources from all the local peoples, and then they distributed the resources out where they thought it should go. Probably the people that were most loyal to the king. Which, of course, means you're going to be loyal to the king. Because if you're not loyal to the king, do what the king says, fight when the king tells you to fight, you're going to starve. You don't really have a choice. Yeah, this redistribution of wealth. That sort of explains the economy a little bit, how their economy worked. They have a language known as Linear B. It is based upon a previous language known as Linear A. Why do they call it that? Because, well, two reasons. One, we don't know what they called their language. We don't know what they called it. And number two, for most of our last, 150, 200 years, we were not able to decipher it. Linear A, which was probably the language of the Minoans, we still haven't really deciphered a lot of it or most of it. A lot of Linear A, we still don't really know what it says. Linear B, some of it has been deciphered. Some of it they've been able to figure out because it is some similarities with modern-day Greek. Ancient Greek, probably. But even then, we're still not entirely clear on Linear A and B. So most of our evidence of the Mycenaeans and the ones that came right before them, the Minoans, is from the archaeological record. The things we've actually dug up out of the ground, or the things that are still standing. Statues, towns, cities, walls, whatever. Most of what we know from them is based upon that, and based upon the later Greeks. Since the later Greeks arose in the same place, there's an assumption that if the Greeks arose here 200 years later, they're probably similar to the people that lived there a couple hundred years ago. So a lot of what we know about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans is simply through inference, through assumption, through educated guesses, but still a lot of it is questionable. But we do know they were wealthy, they had a lot of money, they fought all the time because there's evidence of weapons everywhere. Every single person is buried with weapons, even women and children are buried with weapons. And we know they were closely connected to the Minoan, because Linear A and Linear B, the language of the Mycenaeans, A, the language of the Minoans, very similar. So therefore there was significant connections between the two peoples. Certainly the forerunner of modern Greek, but still difficult to understand. Extremely high value on warfare, competition. Most of as far as religion goes, most of their gods are war gods. Gods of war, gods of violence. Whatever religion the Mycenaeans had was a religion of war. They didn't have any type of scripture. They didn't have any priests that we know of. They didn't really have temples. What religious beliefs and gods they worshipped were simply gods that were helping them in warfare. Now, by the way, these are the folks that is Troy. If you're familiar with the story of Troy, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Homer, that Brad Pitt movie from like 20 years ago, really good movie. And if you're at all familiar with Troy at all, this is them. These are the Mycenaeans, which sailed across the Aegean Sea over to Asia Minor and actually attacked Troy, which is technically in Asia. And that is where there's like 12 layers of the city I talked about earlier. So Troy's a real city. The Mycenaeans are real. There is evidence that the Mycenaeans probably did go to war with a city in Asia, which probably was Troy. Now, all the rest of the stuff about the gods and the monsters and the giants and all that other kind of stuff, that's, of course, mythology. That's, of course, made-up stuff, fiction. But the basis of it, the basis that there was a war between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans, that's thought to be real. There's actually a lot of archaeological evidence that there was warring going on between the Greek mainland and the over here Anatolia. If you look here on the map, you see this is Greeks, this is Mycenaeans. They sailed their ships over here, and Troy was somewhere up here. I don't know exactly, but somewhere here in the northern corner, like along the coast here. I think right here. I think Troy is right here. And so the Greeks did actually sail across the Aegean and did make war over here. Probably doing it to take over these lands. As you can see, they took over islands out here. They did actually take over parts of Anatolia, little chunks. So probably try to take over and conquer this region of Troy up here. And the Trojans fought them back, or didn't. We think Troy burned down at least a dozen times, or was destroyed a dozen times, or abandoned. Destroyed, burned down, abandoned, whatever, a dozen times, and then rebuilt. One of those times was probably the Greeks sailing over and doing it, or 2 or 3 of the times. Who knows with the Greeks? But anyway, it's really interesting. It really is. How much is real and how much is myth? It should be noted that in most of early history, there's usually both. Almost all mythological stories have some basis in truth, and all the true stories are usually embellished with all this mythological, fanciful stuff to make them much more interesting. I mean, how interesting is a story? Oh, 1,000 soldiers loaded up on a ship and sailed across the water and killed 500 Trojans and burned their city. Woo! That's exciting. So you make it exciting by adding in all that other shit. All that other stuff, which, makes it really, it turns it from a boring story into a Hollywood movie, if you will. That's the way it usually works. They add in all the other stuff. And people believed all that other stuff. Don't get me wrong. People believed in gods and monsters and all that kind of stuff. They believed in it. So, for many people who might have read it or heard the story, because initially the story was probably just transmitted orally, they probably believed every word of it. Some of them. All right. This is a dagger. The reason it looks like this and it's corroded like this is probably found in the water, probably found out in the Mediterranean Sea somewhere at the bottom. Thousands and thousands of ships over the years sunk in the Mediterranean Sea. Greek ships, Roman ships, everyone else, lots of other ships. And so this is the blade of a dagger. You can see, look at the artwork on it. It's beautiful. It looks like you have leopards and lions. The detail on this is amazing. This is bronze, probably. This is thought to be Mycenaean dagger. You see things in here that indicate value in art and warfare. Again, look at the detail on it. It's beautiful. Beautiful detail. So they valued art. They valued warfare, violence. Here we have a lion taking down antelope or something like that, maybe. Really interesting stuff. And it's all corroded because it probably sat in the water for 2,000 years at the bottom of the ocean until someone dug it up. But just gives you an idea of some of the stuff they valued. This is most of what we know about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. Stuff like this. So a lot of it is, it's simply, we have to infer what a lot of it is. All right, this is our last section, I believe. This is the end of it. So the violent end to early Western civilization. Yeah, this is the Mycenaeans. We went out with a big bang at the end of this. Pretty bad. So prior to 1200 BCE, we see this relative state of equilibrium around the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Generally, we don't see a lot of warfare around 1200. We see a lot of cities develop. We see lots of evidence of multiple cultures in the Mediterranean, northern Egypt, all the way to the Mesopotamia. And by the way, by 1200, we think they were all connected. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, all connected through trade, through warfare, through exchange of culture, religion, technology, metal, common daily goods, oil and wine and gold and iron. Well, we might have iron by this point. We have some iron by this point. Lots of trade connections, lots of exchange of ideas and goods. Sometime around 1200, the shit hit the fan. There is massive evidence of widespread upheaval from Europe to Africa to the Middle East. Massive evidence of warfare and violence and destruction. By the way, this 1200 years around the time of Troy. This is around the time Troy, we think, probably took place, and again, it's a bit of a guess, around 1150. So around this time period, we see massive invasions, warfare, violence, and how do we know cities are burned? Because they can date it. They can dig it up and actually date the burned remnants using, whatever kind of dating they use, carbon dating, and they can actually determine that this particular house burned down around 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. So they know, generally speaking, when these cities burned. And we see all across Anatolia, Europe, Africa, Middle East, cities being destroyed and burned all within 100, 200 years. So some type of cataclysm occurred. That doesn't mean it's a natural, I'm not saying like, earthquake or volcano or comets from the sky, although some of that might have actually happened too. But a human-made cataclysm. We see just lots of warfare and violence occur all around this time period. It actually leads us into what we call the Dark Ages. Now, you might be thinking Dark Ages in Europe. That's much later. This is the ancient Dark Ages of the Mediterranean, to where we see this disastrous series of invasions, civil wars, and natural disasters, which do include floods and volcanoes, and maybe even a meteorite striking the Mediterranean. There's actually some evidence of that a meteor might have actually landed in the ocean. And you add all these things together, and we see Mediterranean society basically collapse around the entire Mediterranean over a 200-year period. Sometimes they refer to sea peoples, which is a generic term referring to people invading from the water. These sea peoples invading. Probably a mixture of mercenary soldiers, professional raiders and pirates, just other civilizations invading from northern and central Asia. And this puts in this chain reaction of events which cause many people, and it's like a domino effect. You have this culture from over here invade this culture. Well, when they invade, these people run and try to get away, and therefore they invade another society, which in turn has them run and invade another society, each one trying to escape from the other group, which is more powerful and going to conquer or kill or enslave everybody. Which it starts a chain of events that can actually have multiple cultures engaging with each other militarily, sort of as a domino effect. And that is sort of an explanation, we think, for much of this. This causes the Hittite kingdom to fall. This causes the Egyptian kingdom, the Egyptian dynasty to fall, the new Egyptian dynasty to fall. This causes the Mycenaean civilization to collapse. So that's three major ones. I didn't really talk about the Hittites, but they were really big. The Hittites were a major civilization. So the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites. We see this kind of craziness happening in Mesopotamia. So all across the ancient world, we see this massive sort of perhaps human and natural-made cataclysm, this calamity. We do believe there were some earthquakes, possibly tsunamis, maybe even some evidence of a meteor striking the Mediterranean, which would have potentially caused flooding. And since most people lived along the water back then, if something large caused tidal waves in the Mediterranean, just a tsunami in the Mediterranean, which could also be caused by earthquake, and we know there were lots of earthquakes in the Mediterranean. We have a lot of evidence of that. Just a large earthquake, volcanic eruption, could have potentially sent floodwaters that might have wiped out 40% of the population, since most people live near the water. We don't know for sure, because as a result of it wiping everything out, everything was wiped out. From the 1200s to the 800s, we have almost no writing, almost no records whatsoever from almost the entire Mediterranean region. We have the better part, and again, it depends on different areas, but between 200 and 400 years of almost total blackout of knowledge. So we almost don't even know what happened. for 200 to 300 years, other than simply digging up all the remains of the cities, which were abandoned, destroyed, burned, flooded, etc. Yeah. And by the way, there is some scholars believe this is actually where the story of the flood comes from in the Bible. Because it was 200 years after this when the Jewish people, the Hebrews, actually start writing down their scriptures. So it is evidence that this might actually be the flood that actually you see in Christian and Jewish scripture, this whole thing. So, yeah, it's amazing, really, how all these things tie together and how all of them influence later culture and society. And it leads us into the sort of this Mediterranean Dark Ages, which we will pick up on that after. We'll pick up on that after this I think the very next chapter. I think we'll get into this. Here you see some of those societies. You have the Egyptians over here, Mesopotamians over here. This is the Hittites up here. They were actually a very significant culture. But since we don't really ever talk about Hittites again, I just decided to skip over them. We will talk about Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece again. So I just sort of go past the Hittites. There's Troy. There's where Troy was. So, anyway, it goes out with a big bang. It's pretty ugly. And we will sort of start picking up with civilization again after 800. So the people were still there, although population might have been much limited. A lot of people might have died. But I mean, the people were still there. But the difference was, it looks like structured cities, civilization, language, writing, all of it just seemed to disappear for a couple hundred years. It didn't go away completely, because it does all come back. So it isn't like they had to start over from scratch. It isn't like they went back to the Stone Age, although probably some people did go back to the Stone Age, practically. But, eventually it does come back. Anyway, that is the introduction. That is really the beginning of Western civilization. Now, you'll notice we didn't talk about India. We didn't talk about China. If this was a world history class, I would have talked about both. Because in the same time period, India develops an early civilization. China develops an early civilization. Just as big and just as significant as these. But because this is a Western civilization class, I am going to not hardly at all talk about China. I'll only talk about India a little bit. Even Islam. Later on when I talk about Islam, I only spend one small chapter talking about Islam. Because Islam does affect Western civilization, but it is still not core of Western civilization. Western civilization religion core is Christianity and Judaism. So it isn't like there's anything less significant in those other places. You just need to understand this is not that class. This is not a world history class. This is a Western Civ class. So I'm going to, for a large part, ignore the eastern part of the world. Because that's what this class is. Even though they were doing things just as great and just as significant as what we see in the West. All right, that rounds up and ends up with Chapter 1. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you in the next chapter. Bye.